thank you everyone for being here. Um, Today, we're all here to do our part in igniting the discussion around the innovation economy. Today's specific topic set being that around the cross section of real estate and technology. Just briefly on the co-host 186 Ventures along with SVB. We are an early stage venture capital firm based in the Northeast here in the U.S., accompanied by my awesome colleagues here, Julian and Sophie, and we do our part in helping invest and fund founders working on very important problem sets, some of those being within property tech, which is kind of why we're here with this. And we have some amazing panelists here, and we'd first like to give a big thank you to them for making the time to be here, and we'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. But first, we'd love to hand it off to Sharita, our very gracious host at SVB, along with some of her colleagues who are here to say a few words.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I really appreciate you all being here today. My name is Sharita, and I'm a relationship manager at SVB. I work with early stage tech startups, really continuing to support founders and also build up our ecosystem here in New England. So with that being said, SVB is back. We were acquired by First Citizens Bank, and we are so excited to continue to show up for our community, our founders, and our investors, and to keep doing events like these ones where we bring this community together, the prop tech, the real estate community, and partner with amazing partners like 186 Ventures. So with that, I'm going to pass it off and really excited to kick this off.
All right. Thank you very much. And they are really back. We're hearing about so many startups that are working with them and continue to work with them. So just for a quick housekeeping, we'll be up here. I have a kind of agenda here and list of things to go through with the panelists. That'll probably be about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A from the audience. And first, I'll kind of let the panelists go ahead and introduce themselves and kind of as an initial primer. It's likely these panelists here are all focused on different building types, different problem sets, and there's a whole world of problem sets that are top of mind for a lot of owner operators, architects, and other stakeholders around the real estate asset class, whether it be how are we going to manage the new compliance and regulations around CO2 emissions, and how are we going to make sure that our buildings, residential and commercial, very briefly, first being specific learnings as it relates to innovating within prop tech through the companies represented here on the panel. That'll probably be the intros to kick that off. Secondly, we'll then go into workflows being impacted as it relates to the operations and maintenance within the built environment today, so managing and operating within the actual buildings. And then third, workflows being impacted as it relates to the generation, management, and use of digitized real estate data, much of which was not digital. at all up until recent years or even recent months, depending on what kind of data you're talking about. But without further ado, I'd love to give the panelists here an opportunity to introduce themselves, a fun fact about themselves, and what their companies do specifically.
Awesome. Yeah, happy to get it started. Does this work? Yeah, it seems. Excited to meet you all. My name is David Morchanek. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Airworks. We're based here in Boston. We spun out 5 years ago from MIT. And what Airworks does, we're a geospatial AI company that's solving the problem of basically analyzing reality capture data, geospatial data, so that all of you can take decisions faster and better for your property and investment decisions, basically, right? And on the one hand, I have really good news for you all. There's more data available than we've ever had before in real estate to be able to understand more about our properties and our projects. On the other hand, we have no capabilities in actually analyzing that data faster and to actually leverage the data in our decision-making process, right? So that's what Airworks solves by using AI to analyze that data and providing automated decision-making in the process. Yeah, fun fact, that's the hard one. I love traveling, so I've been to all continents of this world besides Antarctica. So if any of you has any trips planned, do hit me up, please. I'm trying to put that in.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Amy Huchthausen. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Stavvy. We are a digital company focused on digitizing the real estate transaction process for anyone that has bought a home, sold a home. Think about all the pieces of paper that you had to sign. You maybe had to travel somewhere to sign all those documents in person and get it notarized and all those types of things. We're trying to bring that online. So we work with lenders, title and settlement agencies, servicers, the entities that, actually service the loan, not the bank that actually maybe sold you the loan. So that's what we're aiming to do. We've been around for around 4 years. I've been with Stavvy now for about 2 years, almost 2 years next month. Fun fact about me is prior to joining Stavvy almost 2 years ago, I worked exclusively in the college sports industry. So I'm still a little bit of a novice when it comes to this space, but certainly enjoying my ride at Stavvy and really excited to continue to learn about the ecosystem and really pleased to be here with you all today.
Hey everyone, my name is Jose. I'll start with a fun fact. I actually thought when I was a teenager I was going to be in the NBA. My mother had the foresight and honesty to tell me otherwise, but she stopped me well before it was too late here. So I'm Jose. My background is in architecture by education, a construction manager by trade, and the founder of Integrated Projects. I think for context, things that have been keeping me up at night is that for perspective, by the end of 2020, there were more buildings in the world than there were websites on the internet. And in the last few decades, while websites have progressed and have been accurately indexed, the same can't be said about buildings. So my team is focused on digitizing buildings. We're building a platform that ultimately brings buildings online with unprecedented accuracy, detail, and speed, ultimately by leveraging LiDAR and 3D modeling technology. This is a big deal, particularly now as rising climate regulations, as well as market demanding less office and more housing. It's a good time for building owners to understand what they own, to verify their footprint, and to be able to own that data in such a way where they can make some meaningful actions. I guess internally, as we say, you have to know what is before you can make informed decisions on what should be. And so we're building the platform to be able to kind of serve as that verification check mark for buildings.
Great. Finally, I guess I'm the practitioner on the panel here, but I'm Jim Whalen. I'm the Senior Vice President, CIO, and CTO of BXP, formerly Boston Properties. We are the largest publicly traded owner, developer, manager of premier workspaces in the United States. Founded here in Boston 53 years ago, and we're a public REIT. Oversee all innovation from servicing the enterprise, servicing all the tech that gets embedded into our properties, real estate for the benefit of occupants and guests, as well as what I call the running of the physical plant, all the things you don't see, like conditioned air in the space and all that, everything in between. So, My fun fact is I have been to 7 continents, so I'll talk to you about Antarctica. I've been like 60 countries, but my fun fact, I'm a big cyclist, so I'm geeking out. It's a rest day on the Tour de France, so I'm like off today, right?
Okay, all right. A lot of impressive backgrounds here and a lot of important problem sets within real estate being worked on. Thank you for those introductions. I guess maybe I'll start with one theme that came across in at least a couple of the introductions was the prospective value of digitizing real estate. And that can mean many different things. I don't know if David or Jose, you want to kick this one off, but what actionable insight can be drawn from, and maybe start by laying the premise by what you mean by actual real estate data being digitized that was not digitized before. Why should that matter to people, to some of the folks here in the room who play around the real estate life cycle? And it can go from there because there's arguments to be made where some of it's still theory and we're still a ways from it actually being rolled out across most of the buildings within Jim's portfolio at BXP, for example. So it'd be interested to kind of just get started on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. So Airworks starts actually at the very early stages of the construction process, even when a developer considers doing a project. And really, we help speed up the process of construction all the way to kind of permitting. And how do we do that? By digitizing the actual physical data that's there on a project so that people can process faster through surveying, acquisitions, estimating, design, and permitting ultimately, right? And what's interesting for us is that before companies like Airworks existed, a lot of this data was actually not gathered until very late in the design process of construction, right? Where like if you've underwritten a project and you invested the money, well, you've basically taken all the decisions, right? And all these decisions were in history taken without actually having good data about a project, right? So you're buying a piece of property, but you actually don't really know the dimensions of it, for example, right? A lot of people don't really survey until they get to design. Well, at that point, all the money is committed, right? And that's why we see changing construction budgets. We see changing construction schedules, right? And we always hear about this industry, right? Like nothing is ever on time. And we hope we can change that, right? By providing more insights earlier in the process that people can then use better data to kind of generate their designs and their early estimates and kind of construction plans, right? And so that's something that's really interesting. And I mean, there's a clear technological reason why that wasn't possible before, right? It was just really hard to get job site data in the past, right? You had to actually like have boots on the ground. You had to measure one point at a time, right? What's referred to as kind of the single point surveying approach to get accurate data. And so the emergence of reality capture, right? If that's aircraft data, or if that's remote sensing data, has really changed the industry in a way that you can collect much more data much faster than ever before, and that is much more accurate than ever before, right? So you're now able, as long as you can process the data, right, you're able to actually speed up a lot of these pre-construction processes that used to be very, very manual in the past, right? So that's kind of how that helps. I mean, we always say that we help clients sometimes in the utility space to install twice as much or sometimes even 3 or 4 times as much broadband and power lines than they would without Airworks, right? And so just the ability to gather data faster and process that data is super valuable for the industry, right? And so that's just my perspective. I'm sure there's others in more the building related process.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand some of the macro tailwinds that are rapidly changing, but then also addressing what's very much not changing. I'll start by maybe suggesting what probably won't change in like 5 or 10 years from now. What probably won't change is if, to Giuseppe's point about use cases, what probably won't change is that we have an owner operator, and around that owner operator exists a variety of functions from acquisitions teams, design teams, procurement, facilities, operations, etc. And what probably won't change is regardless of what tools, whether 3D scanning, 3D modeling, whatever in 10 years we have, it are some basic fundamental questions, right? Can you help me see what I own? Can you help me verify that the plans that I'm using are accurate? And can you help me quantify the space, material, equipment, assets that I have? That probably will not change, right? And so I think that's important to keep, especially as like technology founders. We get so wrapped up in the technology itself that I think it's just important to remind ourselves why we're building this stuff. On the other end, on the macro, what's rapidly changing, to David's point, 3D scanning is something that I think we should be aware of. Today, your average iPhone has like, you know, roughly about the power to capture your average apartment building. That's a big deal. Actually, I'm Brian, sitting down there, is the CEO of Dot3D, one of incredible entrepreneurs kind of working on cell phone and iPad technology to capture buildings. That's an important advancement that we should be aware of. That's one segment. The other is that 3D scans are one part of a larger puzzle. The other is a 3D model, right? This is what typically an architect or an engineer would need, right, to ultimately be able to build accurate plans, right, to then kind of plug into the acquisitions plan, procurement, estimating. When you combine these two things as to the technology that's evolving together with the stuff that's not changing, help me see, help me verify, help me quantify. What I'm starting to find is that there's entirely new business models that are possible to kind of better help serve owners, operators, and service providers. I'll start there. Obviously, we can double click on like specific use cases to acquisitions, design, et cetera. But ultimately, what we find is it boils down to help me see, help me verify the stuff is accurate, and help me count stuff.
So actually, on the verified part, I mean, Amy, it's Stavi, obviously, the kind of where in the tech stack you play with lenders and others around kind of real estate mortgage origination and so on. For what are you finding are, I guess, problem sets related to whether data is accurate or not, and a lot of the kind of underwriting and pipeline that you see, and are there any, I guess, false negatives, like maybe it's not really that bad and we should actually, and I think with the current data that we do have, workflows are actually just fine. There's other bottlenecks that are keeping kind of deal origination happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the last part. I think we're not finding that things are just fine. I mean, for the same reasons that Jose just mentioned about the accuracy and validity of the information and data. You know, every time that every day and every hour that a bank holds your loan before they can do what they need to do, which is like sell it into the capital markets, costs them money. And so if there are errors there that have to go back before the closing or anything of that nature, it just costs them money. So the more confidence they have in the information that's being provided to them in the loan, they know that it's accurate. All of those things certainly allow it to go faster, and then just cost them more money, allow them to make more money as they go through the process. So they can process a lot more loans in the time that it takes now as we're doing all of this stuff manually, where they have to wait for a 200, 300 page or even 100 page document to be mailed to them. What if that gets lost in the mail? All of those types of things cost someone in the value chain money. And so if we can do that, make that data into an asset that can move more quickly and more reliably, then certainly that's going to be helpful to the lenders and the people downstream in that end. But as you or I, and as a consumer standpoint, we need that confidence and accuracy as well. There's millions of dollars lost because of fraudulent requests for money, and these are some of the biggest purchases that people make in their lives, and they're getting a fraudulent request to wire someone money. They're going to do it if it looks and sounds right, just like all of us. Well, hopefully not many of us, but as we all get hit with spam and everything else from our email, that is a real problem for homeowners. And so the more that can be put into data and not on paper and an email, you can collect an audit trail so that's compliant, and it just provides safety both so for the consumer and then also for the lender on that side of it as well.
All right, thank you on that end. So if we actually now start segueing into, I think these are some really good high-level thoughts in terms of, kind of what are some problems that can be solved with if we were to just digitize data and so on. We'll jump more into that and some more specifics around maybe carbon emissions consequences that building owners and other stakeholders, both on the commercial and residential side, face. But if we actually start move a little into the actual operations and maintenance of buildings as they are today, because there's a lot of workflows. Like everyone here has to check in with security or show a QR code. It's not going anywhere, right? Maybe the QR code stuff is new, but the actual turnstiles and actually how people get into a building, that's here to stay. And there's very it's difficult sometimes to innovate on existing infrastructure that is expensive to change that is there. So I guess kind of now, anyone have any thoughts on whether it be real estate security, general property management, or how materials are procured to build something like this? What are some of the opportunities there that folks should be thinking about around the table, and what are maybe you've observed?
Happy to riff on that as much as you want. So, because it's obviously a primary focus when I talk about those three pillars of technology. Our client, the talent of our clients is really, their experience. We're a multi-tenant landlord. I'd love to talk about those dimensions and boundaries, but we have an opportunity as you move through a lobby, as you move through public space or space that we control to service you in a better way. And so we've been innovating for 7 years. I've had an access control technology working group internally who's done the QR codes. We before in 2019 we checked in 1.8 million visitors at our lobby desks. I mean, that's how many visitors we checked in at Turnstile buildings, right? So how do we solve for a better experience? And we've moved to QR codes, and we were an early adopter of that. More recently, Apple 2 years ago, and announced the ability to really open up the NFC protocol in the Apple Wallet for mobile credentials, and we are innovating across our entire New York portfolio. It's a project that I'm overseeing a modernization, and we have a major financial client on 53rd and Lex. I would argue at the top, one of the busiest set of turnstiles in New York City at 8:45 in the morning. And I have, for this one client, over 600 people using an Apple Wallet now, a mobile credential, using NFC, complete and utter reliability, which the prior tech did not provide. And so we're doubling down on that. And as part of that, Giuseppe, in terms of, it's not just about the convenience and to the talent. It's about automating the transfer of records between the landlord and our client, so they become the book of record. It enhances security. It reduces all this manual work that has been done in a flawed and broken process. So it's one that I'm geeking out right now on, because it has a high degree of customer facing impact, let alone on our operations as an example. So that's just one that's very current in my wheelhouse right now. So
I guess a follow-up question on that before we get to some of the other panelists and their thoughts on this question. What are some of the challenges that you and your team are facing in this implementation? Are there any outstanding obstacles that make it? I'm sure there are many, but what's keeping up?
It's a block and tackle. I mean, it's just like, tech enablement is a block and tackle. It's a slog at times, and the orchestration that's required to get all the parties in place to make something happen. I just always I'm amazed at a phone call, and it's a young account rep, and they're just saying, oh, it's going to be so easy. No, it isn't, right? Because it needs, and I would argue also, it needs a sponsor. Like, I'm an executive sponsor of this modernization that's going on in New York, and I play a heavy role in doing and getting whoever the parties are across the fabric of our enterprise to make that happen. And again, that when you're trying to scale something, not just have a discrete location that has one instance of a solution, but you're trying to scale to a level, that's the kind of thing you need internally to find that sponsorship.
Actually, that's very relevant to, Jose, a conversation that we were having this morning. So he had his board meeting this morning, which we're investors in, and we were chatting about kind of in now reaching that scale. Now you're going from 0 to 1, now going 1 too many, to what kind of Jim was alluding to there. What are you finding, Jose? Kind of, you don't have you're very intelligent, and you are, high potential, but you don't have the throw weight, let's say, as Jim at BXP, and all the big resources and team he has there. How are you finding the opportunities and problem sets in helping and finding that champion, and just around that problem set, right, where you're helping an owner operator or an architect that have been doing things for decades or even centuries in some cases, and helping them try to see the future when they're worried about all sorts of other things, right? I don't know if you want to kind of go, and I think everyone on this panel will have an opinion on or take on this.
Sure. I am curious to hear your guys' advice. I could speak to kind of our general strategy. I think what makes real estate unique, certainly different from other sectors, is that it's not abstract. Like there's real dirt, brick, and mortar uh, that I think we just simply can't get away from. I think the first few decades of software really skipped buildings. We did a great job of digitizing text, images, documents maybe, but I'd argue that buildings are still stuck in kind of 1994, right? Like pre-internet era, where like much of our walls, windows, floors, doors are, I mean, besides of course, Boston Properties buildings, but most of them are still stuck like in the 90s, I'd argue. Um, I think that there's a few again macro kind of tailwinds that I think we should be paying attention to. One is that software is one thing for buildings, but because buildings are by definition physical, you need to create some sort of feedback loop, right? To tie it back to stuff, right, that moves and change. I think this is where reality capture comes in, right? So this is where I think David's expertise, I think Brian here, that's an important piece of the puzzle. 3D scanning is nothing new, but I think when you combine that with 3D modeling, what happens is that you begin to create a feedback loop with the real world and like the stuff you're looking at. Today, these are tools used often by design professionals and architects, but they're often relegated to that department. What I'd argue is that that data is extremely valuable to everyone around the table, right? But the problem is that, and when I say that data, I want to be super clear, like what, areas, elements, equipment, quantities of things. This is extremely valuable depending on what side of the table you sit on. This is an important part. To answer your question clearly, as LiDAR gets cheaper and as it becomes closer to your pocket, that is the way you scale, right? So I'm not suggesting that we're going to be 3D scanning towers with phones, but you're noticing that 3D scanning is becoming cheaper, more accessible, and I'd argue in the next few years, it's going to become as kind of readily available as the photo app on your phone, right? You'll just have another app here to scan something. That's a big deal. It'll probably start with residential first. It'll grow to small retail next. But the way we're positioning ourselves is to take that 3D scan data from regardless of what camera it came from and just get really, really good at converting that 3D scan data into accurate architectural, mechanical, and furniture equipment, right? That's our position. So today we're actually digitizing about 6 buildings around the world every single day, from homes to skyscrapers, schools to hospitals, data centers to warehouses. And the way we're doing that is we're actually making partnerships with companies like Dot3D, Matterport, Faro, Leica, Navis. There's people today 3D scanning something in Japan or in Argentina, and they need some help converting that 3D scan to a 3D model. So this is, by definition, how we're positioning our particular company to kind of scale, at a scale that hasn't necessarily been common with like prop tech or real estate tech.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to compliment you for the project in New York that you're doing, because the only reason why I still carry a wallet is literally to enter my office. My car opens with my phone. I can pay with my phone. I cannot access my office with my phone. So love it. Yeah, so the one thing I want to mention, especially in this industry, when we talk about scale, I think we got to get really intentional about the incentive stack around the table, about the people we're dealing with and the processes that are established, right? Every project has a developer. Every project has an owner. Every project then has people that are very specialized in their specific trade, right? If that's the engineer, the architect, or even the sub-consultants on the project, right? They're all incentivized in a different way. And if we don't really understand that incentive stack, that can often block innovation to flow through the chain, right? While it might be totally logic from a high-level perspective for an owner to use a specific piece of technology, well, for the owner, that problem might be so small that like he really doesn't care because it's just so far away from them, right, that they might not even know about it, right? So understanding on who has that problem actually, who feels the pain every day, and then who can we talk to that becomes a champion inside the program is really important, right? For us, that's where we've been really the most successful. Like, for example, like when you look at large engineering companies, 75% of what they're doing is still cost plus projects, which by design means they're paid by the hour, right? Well, you save them an hour of time, they actually lose money, right? Which is counterintuitive to the entire ecosystem and what we're trying to do here, right? So ultimately, we want to create a world in which like everyone is better off by using technology, but just accepting that that's not always the case. I think is the first step, right? So that's why kind of bringing technology to real estate is bigger than just inventing a cool product that people could use, but really thinking through like who can actually benefit from using that technology and getting their buy-in, right? For us, that often means, yeah, engineering companies that, for example, are very forward-looking and need to save time and replicate what they're doing and maybe have a staffing issue, right? Have a real problem in getting projects done, right? Or for example, the big trends we're following in deploying broadband cables, deploying power systems. You can't do that with the people that currently exist at the speed that we want to do it to achieve our goals, talking about global trends, right? So that's areas where like technology is very welcomed and everyone kind of thankfully receives them, right? Because they solve some really quantifiable problems, right? And so that's interesting as you look at this industry. It operates a little bit different than maybe some other areas that you all might be involved in.
And Amy, I would like to kind of lead your question a little bit specific to kind of within financial services, how for the builders in the room, whether at startups or maybe larger scale organizations, how are you finding kind of identifying the champion or sponsor within a bank, small or large, or loan servicing company, lender, whatever it might be across the stack? What are some of the kind of problem sets and learnings that you've observed with your time at Stabby?
Yeah, I would say it's very similar to what you've heard from these other three gentlemen on the panel in terms of you absolutely need a champion. We find that selling into big banks and lenders, obviously you can imagine it's not going to happen overnight. It's probably not even going to happen in a month. It's a very long sales cycle for any host of reasons. But just as they contemplate what that means for their tech stack and what exists in this ecosystem is you have to integrate with so many different parties. So we might get a lender to use Stabby as their closing platform, but who is their loan origination system? Do we have to integrate downstream with the title production software? And so all of those factors have to be taken into consideration even after you find that champion. But it's certainly critical given the scope and size of some of these big banks and lending institutions, but also at your smallest of title and settlement shops that might just be like 5 or 10 people, getting them on the other end of the tech spectrum, right, who maybe are still very much used to paper and very much like the personal interaction of the closing and be able to sit across the table and see the smile on the face of that consumer that's just purchasing their home. You don't want to. We've discovered in our sales process you can pitch digital and you can pitch that you're saving them money by doing all this stuff, but there's a human element into these transactions because they're so powerful and impactful on a person's life that finding a way to blend the digital while not completely substituting the personal impact is something that we are continuing to modify, but continue to find that sort of sweet spot when it comes to the title and settlement. But most definitely, Giuseppe, at the high end in terms of lenders and the integration partners, it takes an awful lot of work, an awful lot of discovery work with the different tech partners and getting the tech stack right. And then figuring out when the right time is to make that switch. So right now, obviously, the market is not as high flying as it was. This is an ideal time to do that because it's really hard to pump the brakes when they're closing millions and millions of loans on a regular basis. So this is an actually ideal sort of selling market for us to be able to talk to the lenders and other servicers about switching their tech stack to be ready when the market returns to the levels that we all hope it to return to.
We say that all the time is like in a slower period when you can have the organization on our side captive. You double down on tech because I was greasing the skids in 17 and 18, with what we were doing, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
All right, let's segue to carbon emissions. It's a pretty big problem. I think the kind of what we're experiencing here this summer in the Northeast is evidence of that in many ways. But maybe, Jim, BXP, you see a lot, right, across the entire asset class. I guess, what is at top of mind for some of your clients and even internally as it relates to carbon emissions? What are some of the efforts that you're seeing being implemented and prioritized? And maybe what are you not seeing enough of that you'd like to see?
yeah. So I just would say like we've had this sustainability journey as a company. We did our first filing of GRES, for example, back in 2013, I think, and I'll just say it was a shit show. You couldn't trust the data. It was all manual. And we went on this journey to basically rationalize that stack and put in a consistent way of metering to create a common denominator across our entire portfolio. that allowed us to have confidence to state sustainability goals as a company publicly, that we said 5 years, we met 3 years early, we restated, met those early, because you start with measurement. I mean, I really like, you don't get enamored necessarily with the latest tech, but you start with a measurement that you can then rally and focus your efforts around. So I'll just kind of start as a foundation. That was a kind of a foundational piece. So really in the last 3 years, it's more about like, what are the next investments we make as a portfolio to do those next incremental gains that we need on this journey. Like, we're committed to, decarb of our operations by 2025. We're sitting in 23 already, right? Got 2 more years on that journey. And so so the pie of how you achieve that, there's a component that is about operational efficiency, right? And how do you think about the some of it's investment, capital investment of plant, right? You have a stack to realize that goal. And so really, from my perspective, I'm more about the operational efficiency, like what tech can be brought in. I mean, we engineers who geek out on the, we're taking an existing building in Needham, Mass here, existing to a neutral position. I mean, that is rarely done. It's mostly done on greenfield opportunities, right? But we have a partner in Wellington Management who's partnered, willing to pay a higher rent to realize for their talent that campus they've built out, that they're gonna lease for us out in Needham. So I think that again, the journey is around these incremental opportunities. So we have created kind of like I chair a monthly engineering leadership call focused on our tech, focused on what we are doing for pilots around the company, whether it's real-time monitoring solutions like realizing local 94, 97 in New York, or Berto just came out, Cambridge just came out, LA. I mean, we've got the local regs driving us separate from our own commitments, and what tech is going to give us those operational. Not every asset requires it. It's not a portfolio necessarily play. It's about innovating at specific needs, whether it be FDD, whether it be real-time monitoring. We're doing a bunch of things with several different providers, right? So there's a little bit of context and a lot packed in there. So
No, that's all great. And I think if those are some great problem sets to potentially, build a company and offer a service for Jim to go ahead and maybe repackage, right? And some of the ones up here too, right? But I don't know. Here's the go thing.
Yeah, absolutely. What I recently learned, what I really found interesting, is that there's really 2 big drivers for CO2, right, in this world that we're trying to tackle. One is buildings, right? I think I don't know what the exact number is. You might know that, but it's like 40% or something, right? It's like
high.
a pretty crazy number.
Yeah.
And the other one is transport, right, and travel, basically, right? So electric driving that we're trying to solve. But even buildings, HVAC systems, right? Like moving away from fossil fuels, building in new HVAC units that are purely electrical. Well, it turns out if we all do that, and really what Jim is trying to do 2025, I think the world is trying to do by 2035, well, it turns out we're missing 60% of the electrical grid to even actually do that, right? So great, we're all putting in new systems, we're buying new cars, but we can't actually supply that power, right? So the problem is a lot bigger than just the building
and
itself.
the grid in New England sucks.
Yeah,
Excuse me. It's
and
in a
exactly,
really bad
100%.
position.
So which is great, right? Because we have to upgrade it anyway, so we might as well do it the right way, right? But like that's something that Airworks is thinking through. Like, how can we help? Because if we're moving at the speed we're moving today and updating the grid, it just will not happen, right? It's just we won't have enough power and we won't have enough fiber and we won't have enough any of the systems that we need to make it happen, right? So how can we use new technology to implement all of these processes to gather better data and just speed up some of that decision making and grid updates, basically, right? That allows then the homes to be more carbon neutral and transport to be more carbon neutral, right? So those are interesting just full system problems that we can all solve.
I was just going to say, just real quick, the side note is like, I oversaw our indoor air quality initiative coming out of COVID. We moved from testing of the air to active monitoring of the air with technology and sensors. And what came to me is like this triangle where, if you think about the top, we're sitting in space here. There's a comfort level right now. It's not that good, actually. And on the other side, it takes energy to actually generate this level of comfort. And this third leg is about the quality of this air, the quality, which has become more important, right? So you have this triangle, and what have we been doing the last 10 years? We've been totally focused on the energy consumption, to balance comfort, but not really focused on the air quality. And so what happens with the equation? Come here. I'm just trying to tie this together, like with the data story here. Today the outside condition sucks. I'm using this word "suck" a lot. Outside really is horrible, right? And the occupancy of this space right now is pretty amped. And we're generating a lot of, so the air quality is actually not that good right now. I'm just going to tell you. So you have this kind of, this is solvable with tech. Like this equation is an equation is solvable by what's going on outside, what's the occupancy of the space. You can do, and solving the data that's required to make this a better experience while achieving the energy goals that we have. It's really, I mean, to me, that's the challenge for our HVAC systems and the data inputs that need to come into that equation, for lack of a better word. So sorry to riff, but
No,
it ties
that's
together
very
a couple
relevant.
of themes. So
That's very relevant, Jose, just because a lot of what Jim just said on this last thing and the one before came up in a lot of the debrief we had, kind of when you were on the panel with the New York City Department of Buildings and kind of seeing what your own customers are thinking about. But
Yeah, I was a few weeks ago. I was on a panel with the Department of Buildings from New York, as well as some other kind of service providers, entrepreneurs, speaking about Local Law 97 and recent regulations for building owners to report on their footprint, specifically the emissions that their building is emitting. This one keeps me up at night, guys. I'll throw out a few things that keeps me up. So. There's this figure, the 1.6 billion buildings out there. We have 27 years, right, to do something about it. Regardless if you're into the science or not, the goal here is how do we improve our buildings, right? Ultimately, what we're really talking about is how do we improve the heating, cooling systems within our buildings, the windows, the fixtures. We have to do this. Just basic back of the napkin math. 1.6 billion divided by 27. Divided by 365, I think that rounds out to something like 200 something thousand buildings a day. What keeps me up at night is I don't even think we have an industry that's ready to service this at the scale. Now, of course, you can make the argument that of the 1.6 billion, maybe a portion of that really is kind of what's causing the outsized emissions. But what I'm suggesting is that I think there needs to be profound disruption in how we actually service buildings at a scale that I think just we haven't seen. Building owners, I mean, step one is just knowing what you have, right? This is naturally what we're building an organization to do, is just know what you have before you can then know what you got to do about it. So we recognize we're a small piece of a much, 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 much larger puzzle. Once you know what you got, then you got to figure out what's wrong. You got to identify it. In our case, we want to 3D scan buildings in such a way where we could tell you down to the doorknob where things are and quantify it. That's our piece. But we then also recognize that, Jim is then going to have to relay that information to some supplier that could then actually do something about it, right? Change out the HVAC systems or doors or windows or fixtures or whatever that might be. That's the next part. There's a whole supply chain right after that actually has to supply this material. I have to admit, this one, I'm naturally an optimistic, but I struggle to see that without profound business model innovation, how we're actually going to rise to the scale I think we got to move, at the speed up we got to move. It's going to kind of be all hands on deck on how we finance these updates, design these updates, build these updates, track these updates. Capital cycles, life cycles. As a service provider like myself, I have to understand kind of at what point in the life cycle can we come in? I mean, there's a host of opportunity. I guess the bright side is that it's now better time than ever to innovate on how to service these buildings. There's a lot of work out there. Emissions is just part of it. Ultimately, what our piece in that is ultimately for buildings to understand their emissions footprint. They got to know. They got to verify what they have. And not surprisingly, a lot of building owners will say something like, "Hey, I've got some CADs rolled up in the closet that I think these are right," which obviously we know the challenges there. But first things is let's verify our buildings. Let's make sure we understand what we have.
all right, thank you. And then I guess one more specific question. Turn it over to Amy, and then we have one last broad one before we open it up for Q&A with the audience. I guess specific to financial services, I'm kind of just curious around how do you think the transaction lifecycle will change? Are there any disruptions is a strong word, and people in tech we love throwing it around. Nothing against you. I use the word disrupt too a lot, but how much of the actual real estate transaction in any forum is actually going to be disrupted versus a slow evolution, and what is one of the biggest predictions that you have? Some kind of kind of two-folded question there, and then I'll hand it over to everyone else. For the
Yeah, I think there's still a ton of opportunity to improve that transaction life cycle for sure. I mean, one one thing that we are talking about internally for sure is looking at how can we make some of this a self-serve experience for consumers. And so maybe it's less that first-time home buyer for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. That's still a really impactful emotional experience, and you want that to be memorable for that person. But think of all of the millions of people that have to have their loan modified, or God forbid, they enter forbearance or foreclosure. Those are really sensitive on the other end of the emotional spectrum, right? Really sensitive, private moments in their life that they have to right now still go through the hoops of talking to many other people, taking time off of work to go down to the notary to get their documents notarized, take other time off work to actually sit down and like close or modify their loan. If you can do that in a self-serve basis where they can just do that in the privacy of their own home or at their workplace in a matter of like an hour or a few minutes, that is obviously a much better consumer experience. And we're still not quite there yet when you think about that from the servicing and loss mitigation perspective. One area as it relates a little bit to some of the themes that we've heard today is, there's you or I that might hit into a rough spot if we lose our job and we can't pay our loan. There's those moments for sure. But there's all sorts of disasters that happen. COVID was one of those opportunities where it affected massive amounts of people that all needed to have some relief because many of them couldn't go to work, and so they couldn't pay their loan, and you want to keep them in their house. And so being able to do that in a critical mass perspective, you can only really do that if you have sort of self-serve opportunities to have that technology. So those are some really, I think, exciting ways to improve that transaction lifecycle, Giuseppe, in the loss mitigation space.
That's a lofty prediction there, but if there's a company that can pull that off, it's probably Stabby. So I guess that wrap up here. What is your very general on purpose? What is your prediction on some of the greatest breakthroughs, or one particular breakthrough that you kind of hope to see or will see? We will all see in the prop tech world over the next 5 years that there is not enough attention on today.
Well, I think one that's interesting that I find really interesting is really treating cities as a whole together, right? And modeling it out almost like an ecosystem together that's really the sum of many individual parts, right? Like we're really good at we're starting to be better at using modern technology for one project. Well, how does that work with that project being in a city, right? That city comprising many different projects, right? So if we're driving one of our visions is to build more livable cities, for example, right? And so when can we do that? We can only do that if we really look at data from the city all in aggregate and see how it interacts with each other in an ecosystem, right? And that drives like simulating wind, simulating temperature, right? Simulating traffic, and the impact of all that on each other is really, really important, right? So I think that's an area that's super exciting to me, that we actually can treat Boston as a mathematical model that all kind of works together, which then improves living conditions for everyone, right? And so I'm super excited about that, and I think we're starting to have enough information both on a building level as well as on a macro kind of ecosystem level to be able to actually take these kind of decisions, right? Which is exciting, and we've never really been in a place to do that, right? And so it goes all the way. People always ask me about Gen AI, right? Like once we're there, that's when generative AI becomes really important, because we can answer questions like, if we wanted to improve travel from here to Newton, what do we have to do in terms of changing the environment, right? And or if we wanted to add 2,000 more housing units, where can we do that? Or, right, if we wanted to develop another mall, like where's the place to do it, right? And so all these things can be answered at some point, and that's really exciting how that all kind of plays together with where the industry is headed.
And I'll just kind of come back to my theme of the triangle, and that I would love to, I do believe in this decade, this whole idea of a self-tuning, self-commissioning building environment, and achieving that with platforms that offer that is within our grasp and our reach. And so that's the one I'm very focused on. So.
I'll say, one of the things that we still don't have a federal RON bill. RON meaning remote online notarization. We're up near, I think, close to 45 or so states. Even in Massachusetts, we just passed it this legislative cycle, and it's not effective until January. And so until we get sort of that federal bill and some national standards around that, the RON adoption rate, which right now is hovering, I think, around 2, 3, 4% of the total market in terms of loans. You can see the opportunity there that exists. For companies like Stavvy and our peers in the community and in the ecosystem to go change. So until we get some critical mass adoption towards that, some of the other advancements from a generative AI in this space, obviously there's lots of opportunities there, but we need to start to see the real traction in the market as some of our regulations and things of that nature really get up to speed for what the consumers actually want. As we think about this next generation of home buyers who are used to doing so much on their phones or on their tablets, are they really going to want to walk to someone's office and sign those documents? Probably not. Does that mean they want to sign 200 pages in some sort of PDF or portable document on their phone? Probably not. And so we need to think through all of that from an experience standpoint, but in a way that still captures the data and preserves that unique experience that they have when they're buying a home. And like I said earlier, when they have to go through other loan modifications or those types of things to make it as simple as possible for the consumer.
Yeah, I think that the what's the major internet service provider here in around Boston area? Verizon.
Comcast, Verizon.
Comcast. Okay. So RCN. All right. So the reason I ask is I genuinely believe that I think with the advancements of certain technologies as well as just the general trends in just our kind of consumer behaviors, I think that building services will look closer to internet companies than they do kind of the current state of prop tech in that kind of traditional SaaS and selling a subscription and kind of a single point solution. What I mean by that is back in the 1950s when there was technicians that were walking into homes and buildings and wiring up offices and schools and whatnot to set up the next kind of decades of advancements in telephone, later the internet. There will be a future where we have the technology to digitize buildings, capture them accurately, create accurate base building conditions, right, and then proactively provide services. I'm going to not use the word disrupt, but I do think that is going to change fundamentally service providers like designers, architects, engineers' relationship to how we can proactively change buildings. On our platform today, we have 3,000 or so buildings across New York, Boston, LA, San Francisco, London, and a few other major urban markets. We could tell you down to the doorknob what's there, right? We have construction grade accurate documentation. There is no reason why, for example, we can't work with our owners to essentially connect that data proactively to the Genslers or whatever of the world, actively trying to figure out how do we convert offices to resi if necessary? How do we proactively account for our emissions and footprint? In other words, what I'm suggesting is as we capture data, it's going to be a proactive service model that I do think is going to change this kind of reactive design, bid, build approach where you just kind of wait for an order to come to you. Whether that's tech or services or a combination of both, I don't know, but I do think that there's an opportunity here that has to do with data and services and capture services.
Very well put, everyone. Okay, we'll open it up to the audience for a few questions. Yes.
So I've been around in the 3D imaging business for over 2 decades now, and when we first started out, our previous startup, the 3D laser scanning was largely focused on the large industrial companies. And back then it was, before BIM, it was called Plant Life Cycle Model. And the whole idea was we're going to capture, with the technology was there, we're going to capture this, we're going to run our plants by the plant life cycle model, and it didn't happen. And it's happening more today because the technology is easier. But I guess I'm going out to the panel, but mostly to Jim. The big impediment back then were the owners. Because when you talk to the engineers, they'd say, well, we'll do it if the owner pays us to do it, if they tell us to do it. And everything the owner did was all project related. And they didn't care. So Jose's talked about the feedback loop and being proactive, but it still comes down to the owner saying that they're going to do it and changing the legal paradigm that also is involved in who's going to be responsible for what. So I'm just asking, as the world changed?
I probably date myself with those, with your references too. And so being on this journey for so long in commercial real estate, so one of the issues that is kind of I would just say an opportunity and challenge is, we are a multi-tenanted landlord, and I control the core. We service Fortune 1000 companies who come in and curate a space like this, and we're providing utilities for this space, right? So I don't control the light fixtures that go in necessarily in here and everything else, right? So when you talk about BIM, I've sponsored in my career a number of, or digital twins now, or whatever those opportunities to take construction and hand it off to operations. But the lack of sponsorship, the cost, the people, the resources you have to dedicate to managing that once it's on a handoff, it's not for the value as a multi-tenant landlord who is focused on the core and not necessarily the space. That's a fundamental friction on terms of some of the enablement. So again, I talk about an opportunity and challenge is, we are a multi-tenanted landlord, and I control the core. We service Fortune 1000 companies who come in and curate a space like this, and we're providing utilities for this space, right? So I don't control the light fixtures that go in necessarily in here and everything else, right? So when you talk about BIM, I've sponsored in my career a number of, or digital twins now, or whatever those opportunities to take construction and hand it off to operations. But the lack of sponsorship, the cost, the people, the resources you have to dedicate to managing that once it's on a handoff, it's not for the value as a multi-tenant landlord who is focused on the core and not necessarily the space. That's a fundamental friction on terms of some of the enablement. So again, I talk about the nirvana of a self-commissioning, self-tuning building. And that's going to take some partnership with our clients to realize that kind of vision, because again, we don't control necessarily the build out of their space. We can dictate standards. So I do think, I think one of the other paradigm changes in the industry is really this partnership and collaboration with our clients. That's already increasing. Will be driven by the SEC. The SEC, disclosure rules aren't out yet, but we service a lot of public companies, and that's going to force dialogue with our clients on a much more elevated, that's my prediction, level that's already started with some informed, more advanced clients in our portfolio. So just a couple of, it's just again, and then the cost, to me, that's the dynamic after trying to do this several times in my career and seeing where there's an opportunity. So.
I have a comment to that too. So I come from the aerospace world. I used to be with Airbus in Europe, building aircraft in both kind of engineering and manufacturing. And really everything has been in aerospace, right? Every part to its last part number, you know exactly which serial number is installed in the plane. You have a detailed 3D model, and the life cycle from changes in the plane to the changes in the model is super close, right? And so my first question for real estate is like, why doesn't it work? Right? Why are we struggling so much in creating BIM models for every building? And yeah, 10% adopted, but really the rest doesn't, right? And I think what you just said is it comes down to that. It comes down to cost, right? A plane, you design a plane and you build it 10,000 times over. So you can invest in that digital process to create this digital documentation. It's really worth it because you'll benefit from it over the long term. On a building, it's usually an individual project. So getting it done quickly with traditional methods is most often cheaper. Well, how do we solve it? By bringing costs down, right? And that's really, I think, the big benefit of our area is
Again, different
that,
for different
right?
for hospitals,
Yeah.
Education campuses, corporate builds. Again, I'm talking from as a multi-tenant landlord. It's just again these different business models that are
Yeah, but we have an opportunity these days, right? Where like, I mean, the
Right.
fundamental problem we're solving is you can capture data really, really quickly, but turning it into BIM is extremely expensive. While using AI, similar to what you guys are doing, Jose, right? Is if you use advanced analytics now, you're able to bridge some of that gap.
and drive costs.
And drive costs. So, and then it actually becomes a lot more interesting for the owners, right? It
Yes.
becomes a profit driver and not a cost function, right? And that's what we got to work on.
Yeah, I think we've I think the real estate industry at this point doesn't face a technology problem. I think we have all of the ingredients necessary to solve some of our biggest challenges. We've got capture. BIM has been around for some time. You'll notice I don't use terms like digital twins or anything like that because I guess I think as a service provider, and I include myself in this as architects, engineers, etc. I think we've done a lousy job of like talking about. I think we talk about the tools we use, right? Like, hey, here's BIM, here's digital twin, and like you kind of almost kind of expect the owner to kind of know what to do with that. Um, I noticed that in our case, when we kind of flipped the switch and be like, hey, forget BIM, it's a means to an end. Um, but what I could suggest is that by capturing your building, converting it into an information model, we can extract the ones and zeros to produce, for example, a cost segregation report. Faster, better, smarter, more affordably than typically what you would have to do hiring a tax advisor who's going to go out with their survey with the clipboard, manually count stuff, come back to you, put a spreadsheet. That's what I'm suggesting is that BIM capture, these are means to much larger ends that of things that won't change, right? Ultimately quantifying stuff. Similarly, we could suggest the same thing across whatever other workflows we're talking about. But I think changing the value proposition is, I think, the key here. Because otherwise, we're going to stay in the kind of the architect and engineer land. We like to kind of geek out on the tech stuff, but I think we face a value innovation challenge, not a technology challenge. I think.
Very well put there. Any other questions? We were kind of tight on time. Maybe we take one or two more at most. Yes.
This is a public partnership question, really. Amy, you touched on it, Jim, you too. I'm wondering, like, how much of innovation across your businesses and across the sector does involve or require regulatory modernization or regulatory partnership? And part two of that question is, how do you, as technologists, get a seat at that table, or get the regulatory environment to work with you to help your modernization goals?
Yeah, it's a big part of what we do at Savvy and some of the challenges, opportunities that we face. How we tackle it is we have, at least from a Savvy perspective, we've got some experts that have worked their careers from the GSE space, from our general counsel to our VP of Industry and Regulatory Affairs that also used to work at the FHA and housing policy. So there's lots of institutional knowledge there, and just as things go, connections. They serve on different committees that are influential in developing policy or thinking of at least being able to receive information in terms of know what's coming around the corner when it comes to different regulations, whether they're NIST or whatever else that we're subject to at the state level, at the federal level. And that's how we, just get an advantage, I think, at Savvy to know what's coming. Given that we're still an early stage startup that has limited resources, having that level of knowledge and expertise in-house is certainly invaluable, so that when we are advising our product and engineering teams to build, we're doing so with a high level of confidence that what they're building is not going to have to be reworked in a month later because the regulations now change. Obviously, there's always a fluid and dynamic environment, and we have to keep a pulse on it, but I feel like we have invested appropriately given our size and stage to make sure that this isn't something that catches us. Something else might catch us, but we feel really confident in how we've supported ourselves from a compliance and regulatory perspective.
And just real quickly, it's the decarb regulations we try to obviously influence either through organizations that we are active with, like REBNY in New York, Real Estate Board of New York, it's an active voice in New York City, or here locally, like, we were a direct advisor on Berto, which is the the building standards that Boston, Cambridge just came out, but Bordeaux's coming pretty soon here, and being a direct voice as an advisory. So again, you look at where the opportunities are in the dynamics of each of the markets. Right?
Okay, well, with all that said, thank you everyone for being here. We do have some food and refreshments, so definitely be sure to eat before you leave. Another big thank you to the panelists here. You may have an opportunity to chat with them privately afterwards. Another big thank you to SVB and Sharita for making this possible. And thank you.